So what if I were to tell you that every hitting lesson that you've ever gotten has been a waste of money? My job by the end of this video is to convince you that every single hitting coach that you've been to hasn't been teaching you this specific strategy that I'm about to explain, and therefore has been a waste of money in my opinion. You see, if we're gonna try to understand how to generate the most powerful, repeatable, and efficient swing possible, then the only way that we're gonna understand this is that if we dissect the movement. And so in dissection, we have to account for all of the parts that are involved in the system, right? Imagine you're dissecting a frog and you have to account for all of the organs or all of the body parts. So if we want to truly understand how to get the most out of the swing, then we need to dissect the swing into its parts. And so if you're 6'5" and 200 and whatever pounds and you can hit the ball barely rotating out of the park, then this video is not for you. But this video is for those who haven't been genetically gifted, but need to get more out of their bodies. And so if we want to get the most out of our bodies, right, 100% of our power potential, then we need to really dive deeper into what happens during the mechanical sequence of the baseball swing. So this strategy that I'm about to unveil for you is a brand new strategy that I guarantee you haven't heard before. It's a scientific strategy, which is pretty opposite of what you find in the baseball coaching culture. The baseball world is full of these kind of made up words, right? Squishing the bug or twisting, spiraling, right? These things are a little arbitrary and random. And I like to imagine this strategy as one of coding, right? If you were going to code a baseball swing into a robot, you would have to have this universal language. It couldn't be explained differently amongst coaches. It would have to be explained one way. And so we can call this language movement terminology, right? The names for the individual movements of the body parts in the human body. And so it just happens that this language exists. It's in textbooks. And that's why a lot of coaches don't use it, because they haven't necessarily read medical textbooks. And so in the medical field, these movements have a name, right? Perfect example is just the index finger, right? So not only does the medical world have a name for each body part, right? A universal name for each body part, we have a universal language to describe, an agreed upon language to describe the movements of that body part, right? So the index finger can flex or it can extend. It can also circumduct to the left and to the right. So the index finger can flex, it can extend, it could adduct or it could abduct, and then it can also do what's called circumduction, which is a combination of all of those, right? So there's 1, 2, 3, 4, 5, 6 total movements of the index finger, right? These are listed, it's classified, and it's agreed upon. So every body part has these movements that are described in these textbooks, and they are agreed upon. So when I learned this in college, I was kind of stunned to learn that this movement terminology really wasn't being used by the hitting coaches or the pitching coaches that I had when I was growing up. And so it was their own language, and every single coach kind of said different things, and it wasn't kind of this unified understanding of the exact movements of the human body. In fact, I never really even thought of to track every single body part and then learn what every single body part should be doing during the sequence. And so clearly this strategy is the most logical, and if I were a lawyer in a court, I could argue this being a much better strategy to learn the intricacies and the fine details of the throwing motion across the board from all these different throwers, or the hitting motion from all these different hitters. So now we're going to look at one of the best hitters in baseball, Shohei Ohtani. And his swing is unique not only because he's setting records and completely impressing everybody who watches him, but he also takes advantage of his range of motion. And this is something that we generally see in Asian baseball players. They utilize more of their range of motion. They rotate a bit more. And so he really does transfer force efficiently. He's very mobile and flexible. And so we can get a really good understanding of what his body part does, because there's a bigger delay, right? So the more mobile that somebody is, like the more of a delay that there's going to be, and that's more of an understanding of what happens, right? To the degree at which you execute the movement is dependent on athletes' abilities and athletes' mobility. But there should be this universal blueprint, and that's what the real message here is today, is that there is a mechanism, there is a strategy of transferring force most efficiently. What is that efficiency pattern? What is that transfer of force pattern? And how do we write it down on paper? And so if your hitting coaches, if it isn't giving you a written plan of what every single body part should be doing, then in my opinion, you're getting ripped off, because you're not getting a full picture of what's happening or what should happen, right? Once you have the plan, then you go out and practice it and work on executing, because it does take a lot of time, right? There's a lot of movements, there's a lot of body parts. This is a brain confusing, and perhaps that's why maybe some people don't do it, because it's just too mentally overwhelming. But mental capacity aside and mental execution aside, you need to be aware that this is what you're working with, right? There's a finite list of body parts, and then there's a finite list of movements that those body parts need to be able to repeat from the start, the middle, and the end of the mechanical sequence. That's it. That's the game. Baseball's simple. You have 3 movements: throwing, hitting, and running, fielding, 4.5, and then you have these certain movements that are done by body parts. And then it's just up to you to learn how to optimize the sequence, right? What movement do you start with what body part first? Then what do you do second, third, fourth, fifth? And it's just learning the most efficient sequence. How do you get the most out of your body? Do you start at your upper body or your lower body? Well, we know that the lower body needs to start the movement, and then the arms finish the movement with throwing and hitting. With running, it's a bit different, right? Running is more of a lower body focus with upper body support. All right, so now we're gonna break down Shohei Ohtani's swing. But before we do that, I want to see if we can create this plan together. I wanna write it out. And so I'd like for you to get a piece of paper and a pen. And so I want you to pause this video, and I want you to write down all of the body parts that you think that we should keep track of. Look at your body and think, what do I want to know what that body part is supposed to do during the hitting motion? List them all out. See how many you can come up with, and then we're going to go from there. Okay, so now we're going to track the mechanics of Shohei Ohtani. Hopefully you created a list of body parts that you want to keep track of. I want to describe all of the body parts that I feel are really important to keep track of. And we're going to really kind of keep track of all of the major joints in the body. So starting from the ground, the feet, the ankle complex, the foot. What is the foot and the ankle doing? What can it do? Where does it start? Where does it go? And then where does it get to for all of these? So the next one above that would be the knees we can keep track of. The hips we want to keep track of. Right, the pelvic bones. But then also we want to keep track of like the biggest bone in the body, right? The femur. We'll call that like the leg bone, right? So hips, legs as a whole, right? Those things can do some things, but also the pelvis can do some stuff. One level above that would be the rib cage, right? The ribs, you have the lower spine and then you have the ribs. So the spine and then the rib cage, right? So we want to keep track of what the ribs are doing. What can they do? But we also want to keep track of the spine, understanding that the upper spine really moves more than the lower spine does in just movement in generally. Then the shoulder blades. So we'll call those shoulders. Then we can move down to the arm. We want to keep track of that, big arm, the humerus. What is that thing doing? What does the elbow do? And the hand, right? So elbow, wrist, complex, or rather hand-wrist complex, wrist, and then the feet is / ankle. So we have 1, 2, 3, 4, 5, 6, 7, 8, 9, 10, right? But we also have a right and a left. So if I just double these up, so you have a right, we'll call it back, we'll call it front, right? So you have 1, 2, 3, 4, 5, 6, 7, 8, 9, 10. Well, you only have one spine, so that takes that out. You have 2 ribs, 2 shoulders, 2 arms, 2 elbows, 2 hands and wrists, right? So 2, 4, 6, 8, 10, 12, 14, 16, 18, 19, right? So you have all these body parts now that you can keep track of. This is information. This is good. You have something to track so that you can finally understand what you need to do to get all of an understanding of what all of the body parts need to do. Okay, cool. So now we need a kind of a system of what we're going to call the before, middle, and after, or the start, middle, and end of the movement. So we can call it start, middle, and end, or we can classify it in, I think, a more scientific approach, which is based off of the loading cycle, if you will, right? So the loading cycle has a load and an unload, right? Load goes somewhere, load then goes somewhere else. And so the most basic movement in the human body is walking, and there's something called the gait cycle. And this gait cycle has a begin, middle, and end as well. And so you have before the front foot lands, right? You have weight on your back leg, and then you have that whole transfer of energy to getting weight onto the lead leg, right? So front foot and back foot. And so this is a simple way to understand throwing and hitting mechanics as well, right? So you have what we call pre-front foot strike, you have front foot strike, and then you have post-front foot strike. So you have when athletes lift up that left, lead leg, and then they put that lead leg back onto the ground and then lift up the back leg, right? So pre, during, and post. So pre, front foot strike, and post foot strike. Okay. Post front foot. And so now is the tricky part. Now is where you actually need the language. And this is what the greatest part about all this is that I can stand here in front of you and tell you that there's something wrong with you. There's a really big deficiency that you have in your game, right? We're going to uncover a weakness today, and that weakness is your inability to speak the movement language. You do not know fluently the names of the movements that your body parts can do, right? You kind of just think you know, right? You're like, well, yeah, my arm bends and extends, right? But that's actually flexion and extension, right? You have abduction and adduction. And so without this language, there's no way that you're going to be able to understand this mechanical sequence because you don't have the language to track what these body parts need to do. And so you can kind of come up with it in your own words, like what kind of makes what you think you should be doing. But here's the really cool part is that when you actually do have the language coming from somebody who can speak the language, I can now really get a better appreciation of what happens during the swing and the orchestration and the combination of all of the movements that make up this explosive, powerful movement that we see on TV. And so if you want to learn this language, I highly suggest that you join the Baseball Training School.